webinar about a new standard on climate change adaptation. The presentation is recorded and will be may be available for you later. You will be informed about that anyway. So let me take the time to present you the speakers of today. My colleague Andrea Nem is sitting here next to me. She's project manager for the Energy and Living section in the Standardization and Digital Solutions Department. And we have the pleasure to have an external speaker today with us. Her name is Celine Phillips, and she's working for ADEME. She's a climate change adaptation program manager there. So, ladies, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is the first time, Andrea speaking, this is the first time we present the standard on climate change adaptation. And I was very pleased to see that several hundreds of experts were interested in this topic. Before we start speaking and explaining the standard, I would like to explain you the context. You all know that we are facing a change in the climate. You can see it in the news, you read it in the political agenda. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, a report found evidence that human activities are estimated to have caused approximately 1 centigrade of global warming above pre-industrial levels, so compared to the 19th century levels. And you also experience this. You can see that changes in climate have caused impacts on natural and human systems on all continents and across the oceans. If we carry on without addressing it sufficiently, we risk increasingly severe and irreversible impacts, such as melting ice sheets, glaciers, more severe droughts and floods, extreme events leading to rising seas, food and water shortages, more climate refugees, and so on. So the associated risks we need to face depend on the magnitude and rate of warming, geographic location, levels of development, vulnerability, and loss, but not least on the choices and implementation of adaptation and mitigation options we take. So what can be done? There are two complementary strategies for reducing and managing the risks of climate change. One is mitigation, which is dealing with the causes of climate change by reducing emissions. We have to bear in mind that even if anthropogenic emissions of greenhouse gases are stabilized relatively soon, many associated impacts of climate change will continue to persist for a long time. So therefore, we need to adapt to the unavoidable impacts. So adaptation is basically about dealing with the unavoidable physical impacts of climate change. So what we have to do is to anticipate the adverse effects of climate change, take appropriate action to prevent or minimize the damage they can cause, and obviously also take advantage of the opportunities that may arise. Today, we'll talk only about climate change adaptation. With the approaching Christmas, you can see a good example for Santa Claus how to adapt to the changing climate in the North Pole. Both at the EU and international level, standardization addresses already climate change adaptation. In the EU, the work is more vertical, which means we focus more on sector-specific standards, meaning that we mainstream adaptation consideration in standards in the key sectors which are the most vulnerable to climate change adaptation, energy, transport, construction sectors, and the related ICT. So the objective is to ensure that we have a more resilient infrastructure in these sectors. Why? Because these have a long lifespan and they cost a lot of money. At ISO level, at international level, the focus is mainly on developing horizontal standards, so management system standards. Why don't we develop in the EU horizontal standards? Because we want to avoid duplication of work at international and European levels. So what we do, either we adopt an existing ISO standard or we develop standards in parallel with the ISO. So we are aiming at having identical worldwide and European standards, also for adaptation. Both ISO and EN standards are voluntary, but the European standard compared to the ISO standards are unique. Why? Because if you adopt one European standard, then our national bodies adopt 34 identical national standards, and all conflicting standards have to be removed in Europe. This gives access to a market of over 600 million consumers. Today we will talk about EN ISO 14090. This was published in 2019, and it's about adaptation to climate change principles, requirements, and guidelines. This is a European standard, but this is an adopted ISO standard. So an ISO standard that became a European standard. So I give the floor to Céline to explain the standard itself.
Thank you, Andrea. Hello, everybody. So I'm very pleased to be able to present EN ISO 14090 today. So I'm working at ADEME, the French Environment Agency, and we're very excited that this standard has been published. And I hope that by the end of the presentation, you will understand why we think it's a really powerful tool for all organizations that are being impacted by climate change. Just to set the scene, this standard is a management system standard. And so just in case you're not familiar with management system standards, their aim is to help organizations improve their performance by specifying repeatable steps, procedures the organization can develop to achieve their different goals and objectives. And so if you follow a management system standard, you will end up creating an organizational culture that engages in a continuous cycle of self-evaluation, correction, and improvement. And we shall come back to this continuous cycle later on in the talk when we're talking about climate change adaptation. A management system standard can be implemented by any organization, large or small, and they're the result of consensus among international experts. And that's very important, especially in a field that's relatively new, such as climate change adaptation. I was a member of the working group that developed this standard, and we really benefited from the fact that we were working internationally and had the best experts on adaptation around the table. So I'm convinced that the standard is definitely a representative of the best available practice internationally today. So the 14090 is a framework standard. Next slide, please. And why do we call it a framework standard? It's because it gives general guidance on tools and adaptive capacities. It gives general guidance to organization in its management processes. And so it's not too specific in its advice and requirements. So this standard can be used both by an organization. It can also be used by other standards writers, and so there and it will lead to other subservient adaptation standards that are being drafted. We'll come back to that in at the end of the presentation. For example, 14091 is a standard being developed on an impact assessment method, and 14092 on the planning process. So next slide, yes. 14090 will help organizations do at least two things. It will help them identify, prepare for, and manage the impacts of climate change on their organization, on their activities, products, and services. And it's very important for all organizations to be looking at what are the opportunities linked to the fact that climate is changing and will continue to change, and what are the harmful impacts of climate change on their activities, products and services. So a business that is prepared for and has set up the processes for addressing the impacts of climate change will have a competitive edge, of course, compared to an organization that hasn't started to address climate change adaptation. This standard will also help organizations show to their partners, the people they work with, for example, their investors or their customers, that they're using the best practice available internationally. Next slide, please. So this slide summarizes everything you need to know about EN ISO 14090. So the standard was published in July 2019, and it contains terms and definitions, principles, requirements, and guidelines. Let me just develop certain terms and definitions and certain principles that we'll be coming back to later on in the presentation. 4 definitions that are particularly important when you're dealing with climate change adaptation are, of course, the definition of climate change adaptation itself. So that's a definition that's being used in the standard, is the one established by the scientists of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Climate change adaptation is a process of adjustment to the present climate or the future climate. And very important to recognize that sometimes adaptation will not be sufficient to deal with some of the impacts of climate change, especially as in a few years the impacts of climate change become more and more important. There's a point at which we shall have to think about transforming our organizations. And the definition of transformation we use in the standard is again the one proposed by the scientific community. Transformation involves changing the fundamental attributes of our organizations. So adaptation and transformation are 2 different levels of ambition of the same process. And then another concept that's used a lot in the standard, it's a key definition, adaptive capacity. Adaptive capacity, we shall come back to it later, so I'll develop it later. And adaptive management, finally, we're coming back to the idea that in a management system, continual learning is key to maintaining and developing the performance of an organization. And again, we shall come back to adaptive management later on in my presentation. There are 10 principles in the standard. Here I shall just flag up 4 principles that we'll come back to later. Flexibility. Why is flexibility a principle? Well, the climate is changing. It's been changing, as Andrea mentioned, for over 100 years now, and it's going to continue to change, and the rate at which it changes will be increasing. And today there's an uncertainty about how fast climate change will happen in the future. So organizations need to be aware of the fact that their adaptation process may have to speed up in the future, and also that there might be unexpected impacts of climate change. So any climate change adaptation plan and strategy needs to be flexible and allow for any unknowns to be dealt with quickly. Another principle important in the standard is robustness. It's important that the decision-making processes used in the organization are robust enough to deal with the complexity of this changing environment. The principle of transparency is a key principle in many environmental management system standards. And finally, I'm just flagging up here the principle of the necessity to have synergy between adaptation and mitigation. As Andrea mentioned, the fight against climate change starts, of course, with the need to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases, so that's mitigation, and any action to adapt to the effects of climate change should also, wherever possible, contribute to the effort of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. There is absolutely no sense in having an adaptation action that increases the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions, since you're increasing then the phenomenon you're having to adapt to. The standard has 36 requirements. I shall present some of them in the following slides, and many guidelines. Who can use this standard? Well, any organization, regardless of size, type, and nature. And as I've mentioned, the standard can also support the development of other standards, help them integrate climate change adaptation into sector-specific or element-specific standards. The 6 main clauses of the standard deal with the different phases of the climate change adaptation process, from pre-planning to the initial assessment of climate change impacts, including, of course, opportunities, the adaptation planning phase, the implementation phase, monitoring and evaluation as part of the learning process and the flexibility of adaptation, and finally, reporting and communication. Next slide, please. So in the pre-planning clause, what is required of organizations? Well, an organization is required to assess whether it's capable of undertaking all the processes described in the subsequent clauses. Does it have the right leadership and the governance needed to address adaptation? Does it have the human resources? Has everyone's role and responsibility been clearly defined? Has the organization identified how much it will cost to undertake climate change adaptation? Does it have the financial resources needed, etc.? The idea is that the organization really demonstrates that it's prepared this climate change adaptation process properly before undertaking it, identified any capability gaps within the organization, and has a proper commitment to the human and financial resources from the outstart. Next slide, please. So the first phase of establishing a climate change adaptation strategy is, of course, assessing what the impacts of climate change are on the organization's activities, products, and services. The standard requires that organizations look both at slow onset impacts, for example, trends in average temperature, and sudden impacts due to extreme events, for example, heat waves. And the standard also requires that organizations look at the impacts of climate change that are direct on the organization and also indirect, for example, through their supply chain. An organization should also be looking at both past trends in climate. Climate has been changing now for quite a few decades. Has it impacted the organization already? And the organization should look then at future trends in climate. And both when they're looking at the past and the future, they need to be looking at the average conditions, trends in the average conditions, and also trends in the extreme climatic conditions, and variability in seasonality of climate. As I've said, it's important to look both at the negative impacts, the threats due to climate change, and the opportunities for development. Next slide, please. During this assessment phase, the organization should document the impact assessment process and all the data and information used. Here, this is a concrete way of achieving transparency, so it's an important requirement within the standard. And of course, the organization should document the findings of the impact assessment and then all the uncertainties linked to the different findings of this impact assessment. The standard doesn't require one particular assessment method to be used. It's open for the organization to use the assessment process that's most relevant for them. So in the standard is just briefly mentioned the fact that you can use risk assessment methods, vulnerability assessment methods, threshold analysis methods. All of these may be relevant for your organization. It's up to you to choose the one that's most relevant for you. Finally, the impact assessment must be reassessed and updated to reflect changes, both in climate change and also in the business strategy and the general context that the organization is working with. This is another way of requiring flexibility of the organization. Next slide, please. So I mentioned adaptive capacity before. So adaptive capacity is a key concept in this standard. What does it mean? The adaptive capacity of an organization is its financial resources, human resources, technical resources, and other organizational capabilities. And so during this assessment phase, it's required that the organization assess its adaptive capacity and have a clear idea of what it will have to do to develop its adaptive capacity in the subsequent phases of adaptation. Next slide, please. So the adaptation planning phase aims to establish an adaptation plan. So it's required that each organization have a plan in which the adaptation priorities are established. And it's also required that not only does the organization have an adaptation plan, but also that it integrates adaptation into other policies, strategies, and plans of the organization wherever relevant. The organization should identify a range of potential climate change adaptation actions, and there will be a strong focus, of course, on choosing actions that lead also, wherever possible, to reductions in greenhouse gases at the same time. So that's concretely implementing the synergy between adaptation and mitigation principle. It's required also that the organization use decision-making methods that are suited to climate change. And so this is implementing the robustness principle. It's also required that the organization adopt an adaptive management approach. So that means that it's continually capturing new knowledge and learning and continually informing its decisions. And in this way, it will have the flexibility that's so important to climate change adaptation. The organization must also develop its adaptive capacity, and finally, in its plan, it must show how it's going to engage with key decision makers and interested parties. The implementation clause describes how the organization shows that it's transforming the adaptation plan into action. So what is key to the implementation phase and the implementation plan? First of all, the organization needs to be describing the roles and responsibilities of the different members of the organization in implementing adaptation. It needs to be describing the organizational capability and the resources that are delivering the actions, how the organization is implementing flexibility and learning. And of course, a key component of ensuring implementation of adaptation is that you have the leadership and the commitment to the implementation of the action. So the commitment by top management to ensuring the integration of the adaptation plan into the organization's business processes, and also ensuring that the resources needed are available. The leadership needs to be directing and supporting persons to contribute to the effectiveness of the adaptation action. And also, the top management should be accountable for the effectiveness of the adaptation action. Next slide, please. The next clause describes the monitoring and evaluation that's required, and requires that a monitoring and evaluation plan be established. So monitoring and evaluation is the key process to ensure the flexibility of the organization. So monitoring and evaluation will inform the organization about the progress of its climate change adaptation. And the monitoring and evaluation will generate knowledge, learning, and evidence that can then inform the adaptive management. In the M&E plan, the organization will assess its progress against the implementation plan and document the results of the M&E, determine whether the initial adaptation plans are still valid, and use this information to update policies, strategies, and plans. And so it's important that this process of monitoring and evaluation be a regular planned activity within the organization. It's up to each organization to determine the pace at which it will carry out monitoring and evaluation. But of course, the ideal situation would be that evaluations are carried out during natural policy cycles of the organization. But as well as having a regular planned monitoring and evaluation process, it's important that the organization recognize that sometimes there will be significant events, major impacts that haven't been anticipated, and maybe also new information will be received, which is important for the organization to take on board. So as well as having a regular monitoring and evaluation calendar, it's important also to recognize that there will sometimes be ad hoc evaluations that are necessary. Next slide, please. So this is the final clause, and it's dealing with reporting and communication to external interested parties. And here this clause is the operational implementation of the transparency principle. So this standard indicates best practice on communicating about climate change, requires that the report content be accurate, verifiable, and relevant, requires that the report be easily accessible and free of charge, and also requires that the information in it be accurate, verifiable, relevant, and not misleading. There is not, however, a requirement in the standard to always report. If an organization chooses not to report, that is up to them. But if they do report, it's required that they respect best practice and very transparent about their climate change adaptation process. Next slide, please. So I've finished with the presentation of 14,090, and this slide is just, the objective is just to let you know that there are other international standards dealing with different aspects of climate change adaptation in more detail. So 14,091 will be dealing with vulnerability impacts and risk assessment in more detail, presenting one risk assessment method. 14,092 will be technical specifications focusing on the adaptation planning process for local governments and communities. And another standard you may be interested in, which deals with both mitigation and adaptation, is being developed for financial institutions. So 14,097 is a framework including principles and requirements so that a financial organization can assess and report how its investments and financial activities are aligning with the objectives of the Paris Agreement on climate change. So next slide, this is the last slide, and it's just to summarize the key learning points of this presentation. So, as I said, this standard is an adaptation standard, so it's the objectives are to reduce the impacts of climate change on your organizations, activities, products, and services. If possible, also the organization will identify any opportunities that it may, the climate change may bring about. Who can use standard? Any organization. As I was saying, at the French Environment and Energy Management Agency where I'm working, we're very excited about this, the fact that the standard's been published, and we're hoping that many French organizations will use it. And I think it will be the same in many other European countries. It's a very useful tool because it will help organizations identify, prepare for, and manage the impacts of climate change. And of course, any opportunities organizations might identify would give them a competitive advantage. And also it will help the organizations deal with any harmful impacts. The standard will also help organizations demonstrate good practice to investors and customers. And what are the main steps? So we saw that the main steps of the adaptation process are the pre-planning, the initial assessment of climate change impacts, the adaptation planning process, which will lead to an adaptation plan, an implementation plan, a monitoring and evaluation plan, and finally a reporting and communication plan if the organization chooses to have one. What are the main deliverables other than the plans? Well, it's strongly felt that for adaptation to be a success, it should also be embedded into all other relevant policies, strategies, and plans that the organization has, and not be just a standalone plan on climate change adaptation. So there I